What's up guys? In this video, I'm going to show you how I took this old concrete sidewalk in the front of my house and transformed it into this by pouring a new concrete sidewalk. This video is going to cover every aspect of the concrete pouring process, from preparing the area, to building the forms, to actually pouring the concrete, and finally how to finish the concrete so you can get a result that looks like this. Let's get into it. So the first step in replacing this concrete sidewalk was to remove the tree in the front yard because the root system was underneath the sidewalk, causing it to crack. After getting that removed, it's time to demo the sidewalk. So typically for a small sidewalk like this, you would just rent a jackhammer, but I was able to get a killer deal for this guy online. So we're gonna test it out, see how it goes. So like I said, I actually bought this jackhammer for a couple $100 on Craigslist, but you can rent one from your local Home Depot. This was my first time ever using one. It was a little bit more cumbersome than I was expecting, but honestly, not too bad. Just make sure you have your PPE, your eye protection, your ear protection, and make sure that you don't jackhammer the electric cord if yours is electric. So after transforming my front walkway into a pile of rubble, I grabbed all those smaller pieces of rocks and got them out of the way. This step was then followed by a couple trips to the landfill to get rid of this concrete. After removing the existing sidewalk, it's time to plan out your new sidewalk layout. For my project, I decided to pour a slightly larger concrete landing, and I'm going to show a little bit of this in the video, but I mostly want to focus on the new curved sidewalk, which is going to connect the driveway to the new concrete landing. To begin preparing for the actual concrete installation, I first marked the general layout of the new concrete landing and the new curved sidewalk with some spray paint. Next up, you're going to want to excavate down approximately 8 inches. I recommend a 4-inch gravel subbase and then 4 inches for your concrete sidewalk. I also recommend some steel reinforcement, but we'll talk about that more in a second. For a small sidewalk area like this, a shovel is really all you need to complete your excavation. I started with the larger landing and then I moved on to the sidewalk, and after excavating to the right depth, use a rake to smooth everything out. After getting everything pretty level, you're going to use a hand tamp to compact the soil, and that's necessary to prevent the amount of settling that will happen to your concrete over time. After compacting the soil, add your 4 inches of gravel subbase, and this is just 57 stone that I picked up from my local stone supplier. Transfer all the stone to your project area until you have a 4-inch base that's relatively level all the way across. And just like for the soil, you want to compact the gravel subbase as well. After confirming that the subbase is level, it's time to actually build the forms. For the larger concrete stair landing, I decided to use leftover 2x6 and 1x6 lumber for the forms, and this is going to give me a slightly thicker slab around 5.5 inches instead of the 4 inches that's typically done for sidewalks. At this point, you're going to assemble your forms by screwing them or nailing them together. Make sure that your forms are completely square before proceeding. Then, once they're level, once they're square, you're going to use stakes to secure them in place. Now, for the curved sidewalk, I'm using a piece of hardboard that was ripped down to 4-inch strips, and this is flexible and will allow us to get the curvature we need for the sidewalk. So at this point, I'm getting the curvature for the sidewalk established, I'm positioning the forms in place, and then once I was happy with how everything was looking, I used stakes to secure them in place. When installing your forms, keep drainage in mind. You typically want to have a slight pitch away from the house when setting up your forms. Getting the form set up is typically the hardest part of any concrete job, but take your time, make sure you get it right, because you can't go back and fix it after you start pouring the concrete. After installing the concrete forms and confirming level, I like to do one last pass with the hand tamp to make sure that the stone is fully compacted, and I also apply a form release agent like WD-40 to the inside of the forms so that when we remove them later on, it'll peel off the concrete pretty easily. Although concrete has great compressive strength, it's actually pretty weak when subjected to tension forces, which is why we're going to install either rebar or steel wire mesh to add a little bit of extra reinforcement to the center of our concrete. For this project, I used 4x8 sheets of steel wire mesh, and I cut it to the appropriate size using an angle grinder equipped with a metal cutting wheel. For this project, and pretty much any project involving a sidewalk, I recommend the use of Rapid Set's 24/6 concrete mix. This is rapid setting concrete, so it sets pretty quickly, but it allows for foot traffic within 8 to 10 hours. So for something like a sidewalk, you can get back to using it basically at the end of a day. To determine how much concrete you're going to need for your project, I recommend that you use Rapid Set's concrete calculating tool, where you can enter the product, enter the sidewalk thickness, the width, and the length, and it'll tell you how many bags of dry mix you're going to need for your project. Obviously, having concrete delivered is a lot easier than mixing concrete by hand, but it's also a lot more expensive. So for this project, we're going to mix everything up by hand, and to do that, you can either use a wheelbarrow and a shovel to mix it up, which is very labor intensive, and I don't recommend that for a large project. Or you can rent this type of mixer from the Home Depot, where you basically dump the bags into the mixer, add water, and it mixes it up for you. And this was the method we used for pouring the stair landing, and it worked okay, it just took a while. But for this project, I had the privilege of using something different. All right, guys, so at this point, we have our forms in place. We've cut our steel wire mesh to size, and I'm gonna be using something called the mud mixer to mix up the concrete. So for the mud mixer, you literally just hook up your garden hose, and then you can adjust the amount of water that's gonna come through these hoses. Then you're gonna take the dry mix, put it into the hopper at the top, then the water is gonna inject within the auger, and it's gonna come out all mixed for you, which makes it so much easier. So after getting the mud mixer in place and getting all of our 24/6 concrete mix from Rapid Set all positioned and ready to go, it was just a matter of loading the concrete into the hopper and making adjustments to the amount of water until we got the perfect consistency. It's a little bit iterative, but once we got going, it started going really quickly. One thing I didn't show super well was that you want to have the steel mesh reinforcement in the middle of the concrete. So I put it at the bottom, I poured a little bit of concrete, and then as I poured the concrete, I lifted the steel mesh into the center of the concrete. I didn't show that, but make sure the reinforcement is in the middle of the concrete. After filling up a good portion of the form, we took a 2x4 and used it to screed across the surface of the forms. This is going to give us a flat surface of concrete, and then you're going to use a concrete finishing trowel to give you an even smoother surface on the top. Use a shovel and some concrete to fill in any of the low spots that were revealed during the screeding process, and then use the hand finishing trowel to give you a relatively smooth surface. Because this concrete is fast setting, we broke the sidewalk into two parts. We took the finishing trowel over the first part and then continued to mix up our 24/6 concrete mix from Rapid Set into the mud mixer until the whole concrete form was filled. After filling up the second part of the form, use a 2x4 piece of lumber to screed the surface of the sidewalk just like you did for the first section. Use a shovel to move concrete to fill in any of the low spots revealed during the screeding process. You might also need to grab some additional concrete with your finishing trowel to make sure that the edges are filled in nicely with concrete. And a quick pro tip is that you can use a reciprocating saw without the blade to vibrate the forms to get rid of any voids. After screeding the entire surface and filling in any low spots, it's just a matter of taking your finishing trowel and getting the surface of the sidewalk relatively smooth at this stage. I do want to note that concrete finishing is an art. It's not easy, it takes a lot of time, and I'm by no means a pro at it. But with a little bit of practice, I'm getting better each time, but it might not look perfect on your first try. The broom finish is going to help make up for a lot of sins. After getting the surface of your concrete sidewalk relatively smooth, it's time to move on to the next step. At this stage, it's a good idea to use an edging trowel between the forms and the edge of the concrete to give you a nice rounded edge. Run the edging trowel along the perimeter of all your forms to give the edge a good rounded look. You want to use the edging trowel after the concrete has set up a bit, but don't let it get too hard. As you can see, the edging trowel is going to leave a slight ridge, and you can either smooth that out with the finishing trowel, or you can leave the contrast between the middle and the edges, which is called a California finish. So at this point, it's time to apply a broom finish to the surface of the concrete. A broom finish is going to help to hide any imperfections on the concrete surface, and it's also going to give you a non-slip walking surface. After the concrete has had a chance to cure, use a concrete finishing broom and pull it along the concrete surface to give it the textured look that you're seeing now. I'll link the concrete finishing broom in the description, but it's not rocket science. You literally just run the bristles of the broom across the face of the concrete to give you that textured finish. Some people don't like the look of a broom finish, but because I'm not a pro, I like it because it helps to hide some of the imperfections. And as you can see here, I'm applying the California finish to this concrete sidewalk, which is a smooth edge, and then you have the broom finish in the middle. Here's how we look so far, and we're almost done. One thing about concrete is it's going to crack. So what you can do is you can install something called a control joint, which is basically going to give you a small relief cut in the concrete, so when it does inevitably crack, it'll hopefully crack within that joint, not on the face of the concrete. To create the control joint for this sidewalk, I used a piece of lumber as a straight edge, and then I ran a grooving trowel along the straight edge to create that shallow relief cut. I cleaned up any abrupt edges with the finishing trowel, and then I also cleaned up the edge along the form. Lastly, I performed a bit of cleanup work with the broom. At this point, I gave the concrete 24 hours to cure, and then I went outside and removed the concrete forms. To remove the forms, you're basically going to remove the stakes and pry it off the face of the concrete with the pry bar. Just be careful not to damage the face of the concrete. After removing the forms, I backfilled around the sides of the sidewalk. And at this point, you successfully poured a new concrete sidewalk. Let's take a quick reminder look at where we started. And here's a look at the final result. Now, although this concrete is not perfect, it's a big improvement over what we had before, at least in my opinion. And once we get some grass planted and some landscaping in, it's gonna look even better. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like down below and subscribe to the channel for more DIY content like this.